You're listening to episode 135 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Dr. Sandraluz Lara-Cinisomo joins us to speak about her study on mindfulness helping caregivers of veterans. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made available from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. We've done several episodes on this podcast about mindfulness for military personnel, pre- and post-deployment, to help them with resulting problems like PTSD or the prevention of it. Those challenges are sometimes faced by others as well, as informal caregivers like spouses or immediate family of veterans can be forgotten in the need for help as they help their loved ones, particularly in underserved communities. Dr. Sandraluz Lara-Cinisomo is a developmental psychologist whose research focuses on addressing mental health disparities in women and mothers, particularly racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, and military populations. Her research approach builds on a framework focused on psychosocial, cultural, structural, and psychological factors. Specifically, she examines how contextual factors are associated with poor mental health in her populations of interest. As such, she takes an integrated approach to understanding mental health disparities in mothers and women. Recently, she completed several studies that examine associations between hormone function and perinatal depression in Latinas. Her recent studies also tested the effectiveness of a mindfulness-based intervention on reducing stress, depression, anxiety, and worry in caregivers of veterans, most of whom were women. Currently, she is conducting a multi-site study on prenatal depression, diabetes, and disease management. Our guest today is Dr. Sandraluz Lara-Cinisomo. Welcome to the podcast. Nice to have you here.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So, before we get into our main topic, which is the research that you've done, and I'm really interested to hear more about that, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay, that's always a funny question to answer because I want to say, do you mean my cultural background or my professional background? So I'll just give you a little bit of both because I think it's important for people to know who I am and what my orientation is when I approach research. So I'm a Mexican immigrant. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, very traditional Mexican household, hardworking, very religious, Catholic. And so I grew up with very, very clear work ethics in our family and the importance of family and support. So it was a very collective environment. And that really helped me, I think, to become successful in pursuing teaching, research, and providing service to the community because I understood early on the importance of the group. And so that is my cultural orientation. And in terms of my research and training, so I grew up in South Central LA, and I was fortunate enough to meet someone who literally drove me to a community college because I was not college prep, and I enrolled community college, transferred to Cal State Northridge, where I got a bachelor's in child development. I was very interested in children and families. From there, I went on to get a master's at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, then went on to get my PhD at Columbia University. So my training is around families. I'm a developmental psychologist by training, and so my focus has always been the life course. And so I've taught before coming to the University of Illinois. I underwent some intensive training at UNC Chapel Hill to learn about hormone function and around reproductive mood disorders. My other arm of research is on mental health in mothers and during the perinatal period, especially during pregnancy and postpartum. But before that, I was a faculty member at UNC Charlotte. And prior to that, I actually worked at the RAND Corporation for about 9 years. And that's where I was introduced to military families. And I did work on looking at the consequences of deployment on the children and the spouse, most of whom were women who were then responsible for all the changes that were happening in their household, taking on additional responsibilities and dealing with the stress of having a partner who was away out of the country, sometimes not accessible due to communication barriers or safety reasons.
Right. Well, thank you for that background. And I want to hear a little bit more about the lab itself and how that really contributes to the work that you're doing, and maybe saying a little bit about your staff as well.
Yes, so thank you for taking an interest in my research staff. So I have a wonderful group of graduate students who we draw from here at the College of Applied Health Sciences. Most of them are either a master's in community health students or they're master's in public health students. So they're interested in health and well-being in general, and they come with different career aspirations, but also different skill sets. Some of my students also come from outside of the country. Currently, I have a student from Nigeria. She'll be graduating in May. She's been with me for 2 years. And I also have a pretty diverse Latino group of students. I have a Colombian student from Colombia who is an aspiring physician. And then I have a Mexican-American student who is finishing up with her master's in public health. And then my other student is also Mexican descent from San Diego. So pretty diverse group. And I've always tried to recruit diverse students, and not just racial or ethnically, but economically diverse. So low-income white, maybe first-time college or graduate school students and their families. So try to make sure that we have a representative sample that really reflects the diversity of the country.
Thank you for that. And thank you for doing that work too. One of the things that you and I had discussed briefly before we started recording was just how really wonderfully diverse the group that you've assembled at the lab is. So thank you for doing that. So let's talk a little bit about this new study that you've done and what it is. Let's say first, what was it that made you want to do this particular study?
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, I used to work at the RAND Corporation where we focused on active duty and Guard and Reserve spouses. And we published some papers looking at the stress that those spouses experienced in the context of a deployment. And so now that there have been a wind down in the wars, and we have a large group of veterans that need services, we also know that this is a life-changing experience for the spouse or other family members who were primarily responsible for helping the then service member, now veteran. And so the RAND Corporation did an interesting study looking at what they defined as hidden heroes, looking at the caregivers. And they found that caregivers of veterans were experiencing high levels of psychological distress because of the number of hours they were having to put in, the different responsibilities they were taking on, and really the stress that comes for caring for someone who needs complex support and healthcare services. So at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I am a faculty member, we have a wonderful center. It's called the Ches Center for Wounded Veterans in Higher Education. And they put a call out for funding, and their focus was on the veterans, But I really made a push in my grant application for focusing on the caregivers of the veterans, because we know that they are unsung heroes, and we know that they take on a lot of responsibility and have an important role in the well-being of our veterans. And so that project got funded. The objective of that application was to conduct a randomized control trial of a mindfulness intervention that would target stress, worry, anxiety, and depressive symptoms in the caregivers. So I'm happy to go into the design of that study now if you'd like.
Perfect. Yes, please do.
Wonderful. So we aimed high. We aimed to enroll over 100 caregivers in our area in Champaign County. We have 9,000 veterans. We don't know how many informal caregivers, that is, caregivers who are not paid for their time, there are in the area. So we sent out 300 postcards to the veterans, hoping that they would share it with their informal caregiver. And we got a smaller than anticipated response, but we were able to enroll 23 caregivers in our area. And we randomized them to either the treatment, that is the mindfulness training, or a waitlist control. We know that the best design is a third arm, or that we have a control group. But given that this is an exploratory study, to our knowledge is the first of its kind, we thought that it would be acceptable research design-wise, but also ethical to do a waitlist control group. So we randomized participants to either a waitlist control or the treatment group. And it was an 8-week mindfulness training. 2 graduate students in our program ran the interventions, and they were highly trained, highly skilled, highly motivated and committed. And so Ellen Ritter and Ryan Santons ran those groups for us. Because our area is so small, we added another site. It's called the Danville Area Community College. They were wonderful there to let us do the intervention there as well. So the training was an 8-week program. Participants were required to attend the 2-hour trainings for 8 weeks, and they were also required to track their home practice. A lot of studies don't include that piece, but we wanted to see whether there was a dose effect in terms of home practice. So that study, was bound by funding and a short period. So it was a 1-year, ramp it up, get it out, get it done, do it well kind of a study. So we concluded the study a year or so ago, and we just published those findings. And what we found was that individuals or caregivers in the mindfulness training reported significantly lower worry, anxiety, and stress. We didn't have very depressed participants. I anticipated that we would, but that is not what we found. Instead, we found that our participants were very stressed, as you might expect. They were also very worried and anxious. And that makes sense given the unknown that comes with caring for a veteran. You don't know when symptoms are going to flare up. You don't know what your schedule is going to look like sometimes, and you don't know how many hours you're going to need to put in. They're also stressed because they're managing a lot. That was a significant finding for us. We also measured mindfulness, the 5 facets of mindfulness, and we found that caregivers in the mindfulness group reported significantly higher levels of observation and lower levels of judgment, so more non-judgment, which are really important for their mental health.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that overview of the study. And, it's interesting as you were speaking and describing that you were shooting for a large cohort. We wanted to get hundreds of people in this, which is very good. Of course, the larger sample size we have, the better we can rely on the results a little bit more. And what often happens is it doesn't turn out that way. We don't get quite the numbers that we want. So one of the things I frequently try to somewhat gently, somewhat firmly, when that doesn't work, remind people is when they complain about small sample sizes. Please understand, researchers would love to have large sample sizes. Of course we would. And sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Either there are funding restrictions or response restrictions into community that might have difficulty responding to them. There are a lot of different reasons why we might see smaller sample sizes, and it doesn't mean that therefore we can dismiss this as completely invalid. As you were saying, this is a pilot, and we're seeing what might be here, and this can then lead to hopefully better funded, larger cohorts where we see, in addition to wait lists, perhaps active control groups as well. But this is the first step for this particular cohort. So I'm wondering, in the process of this, you mentioned a bit about what you measured, the FFMQ, as well as some of the other measures that you had, with results just on a more personal level in working with the people that went through this program. What was it like for them as people? Were there some transformations that you saw just in how they were on a social level with each other or with themselves? What were some of the things that they said that might not have been quite something you would publish in a research study?
Yeah, actually, I have to admit that I get chills just thinking about the change that we heard about, because we didn't do open-ended qualitative interviews about their process from before to after the intervention. But some of the caregivers that I interviewed personally, and that some of my research assistants interviewed, reported back that the caregivers really saw changes in themselves. And in fact, one caregiver said to me, my husband noticed a few weeks into the training that I was calmer, that I was less reactive, and he said it was helping him. And she said, and I think we're both sleeping better. So I think it was an opportunity for the caregiver and the veteran to see how mindfulness can really help them as a unit and individually. What we also found is that these groups got really bonded. In fact, one group, we interviewed them pretty much back to back, and they had scheduled a lunch right after because they started calling themselves the Fantastic Four. And they really leaned on each other. And so that informed us a little bit more about the additional benefits of mindfulness training, and that is the social support. So now we're trying to develop another study that will help us look at that specifically. Because as you mentioned, this is a pilot study and it's the first step. And as far as we know, it's one of the first studies of its kind that looks at the effectiveness of mindfulness and in a highly underserved population, which is the informal caregivers.
Right, and that leads to something else that I want to unpack with you, and based on your work and what you were just mentioning, that it's not just the cohort, it's all the lives that they touch. Mm-hmm. Each other, the people at home. Mm-hmm. It's not just, I'm more mindful from my program at work. It's really rewarding to hear how people talk about what happens in their life at home. Yes. There's that too. So I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about why you find this work so very important with these underserved communities, caregivers, folks who, veterans are so, I think, grossly mistreated and underserved in our society, but not just the veterans, it's also their families, people who love them. I wonder if you could say more about that.
Well, when I was working at the Rand Corporation, and then after I left, I continued doing the work around military families, and you hear just how committed these families are. You learn about the sacrifices they make. You learn about the changes the families experience as a result of deployments or military activities they have to go through, the training. It's a very rigorous process for the service member, but also for the family, and that includes children. Everyone, as they say, everyone serves. The whole family serves. So as someone who cares about the mental health being of families, I thought it was important to conduct a study that we know would hopefully make an impact and make a difference. My hypothesis was that mindfulness would improve the lives of those in the intervention group, which is why we conducted a waitlist control, because we wanted to give them the opportunity to participate in the training after the study wait period ended. But also because if we really want to create a community of mothers and children and husbands and fathers and sons and individuals that are strong, healthy, happy, vibrant, and feel that they have balance in their life, we have to provide a service to do that. The advantage of mindfulness is that it can be a rigorous process, but it's something you will have for the rest of your life. I also went through the training before I launched the study because I wanted to make sure I knew what was involved. And I did the 8-week plan and the 2 hours in the home practice. And I noticed changes in myself. And so I had a little inkling of what the caregivers might experience. but I was just so happy to see that they reported that they had a good experience and that the data supported that.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for doing that work. And I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share with the listeners, maybe someone who's considering doing this kind of study, or maybe there is the spouse of someone who is a military veteran or a caregiver in some other way. What else might you share with them?
Well, first, I want to say thank you to the service members, active, Guard and Reserve, and veterans, and their families, because they really do make huge investments. I think something people might not understand is that some of the consequences of having experienced war-related trauma, whether it's physical or psychological, is that when the war ends, the healing starts, but also the processes that the family has to go through could be lifelong. And so, if we can provide a support system, a service, a hug to really help those individuals, I think we will all benefit from it. I spoke with a friend who heard about my study, and I knew that her husband was a veteran, but I had no idea that she was now, just almost 10 years later, really having to cope with the consequences of the trauma he encountered. So sometimes it's not immediate. It can be something that is a kind of a late onset or delayed onset. So we need to make sure that we're prepared to help at any time point. And so first, I just want to say thank you to them. I think for those individuals who are interested in doing this kind of work, I think they have to keep in mind that any kind of participant recruitment can be challenging. We were very creative in our strategies. We used postcards. We used emails. We asked participants for referrals, but also we had really high engagement. We had 100% retention of our participants. And that's because it demonstrated to them that we cared from the first interaction we had with them. And while we maintained strong and very clear boundaries about research and research ethics, we did convey to them in every exchange we had with them that we ultimately cared about their well-being. And I think that really came through in the fact that they were able to stay on, even though they experienced challenges in attending sometimes. They were 100% willing to participate in the pre-intervention and post-intervention interviews.
Wonderful. Well, for those who are listening, I'm going to have a couple of links on the episode page for this episode. So if you'd like to find out more, please do check those out. Our guest today is Sandraluz Lara-Cinisomo. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate speaking with you today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.